Hello YouTubers, let's do a quick summary of World War II, illustrated by me, Mr. Bartlett, and narrated by me, Mr. Bartlett as well. We'll see if I can do this without messing it up too badly. If I can keep it under 10 minutes, that'd be awesome. Here we go. The Second World War was the most deadly, destructive, and consequential war in history. 17 million military personnel died in the war. Civilian deaths in the Soviet Union and China alone totaled 30 million. Causes of the war can be traced back to the end of World War I. Germany, Italy, and Japan suffered deep economic problems. Inflation was rampant. However, by the late 1920s, economic order was being restored. This trend reversed when the United States entered the Great Depression. The citizens of what would be the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, supported nationalistic organizations which offered hope in the face of these problems. These organizations soon gave birth to tyranny, however. Totalitarian dictatorships arose in the Soviet Union, Japan, Italy, and Germany. These were led by Joseph Stalin, Emperor Hirohito, Benito Mussolini, and Adolf Hitler. These leaders seized power by promising reform through unity. Under the dictatorships, however, terror reigned. Dictators used secret police, threats, imprisonment, and even executions to eliminate their opposition. Some consider the start of World War II to be Japan's invasion of Manchuria, a region in eastern China. Japan continued to demonstrate aggression, effectively conquering eastern China by 1938. Italy, meanwhile, conquered Ethiopia in 1936. Germany, in 1938, united Austria with itself. There was essentially no stopping this aggression, since the League of Nations lacked the power to enforce its treaties. The League had been formed after World War I as an international forum for disputes. In 1936, Germany and Italy allied. Japan joined in 1940, forming the Rome, Berlin, Tokyo axis. During this time, Spain was in civil war. General Francisco Franco led the rebellious army nationalists against Spain's government. Hitler and Mussolini supported the revolution. The Spanish Civil War basically divided the world into those who supported Nazism and fascism and those who were against it. Hitler and British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain held several meetings to restore peace. They agreed that if Hitler took Czechoslovakia, he would not try to acquire more territory. Hitler defiantly broke his promise by invading Poland 11 months later, on September 1, 1939. Germany's Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, quickly overcame the large but poorly equipped Polish army. The Blitzkrieg relied on speed and surprise. It was carried out flawlessly. Britain and France pledged their support for the Allied cause, but stood by while Hitler swallowed Poland. Journalists dubbed this the phony war, not believing that it would result in a real war. German forces then captured Denmark and Norway, seizing vital ports. Following these invasions, Neville Chamberlain resigned. He was replaced by Winston Churchill. Germany, meanwhile, easily took Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The French hoped to hold up the aggressive Germans by use of the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line was a strip of defense along the French and German border. It proved futile, however, as the Germans simply proceeded around it and into France. The Blitzkrieg once again made its appearance, this time beginning in June. It proved effective once more. The French signed an armistice on June 22nd. France had fallen. In a massive air war, the Luftwaffe, or the German Air Force, began to mount assaults on the British RAF, or the Royal Air Force stations. By September of 1940, Germany proceeded to bomb London. This series of attacks on Britain's capital was known as the London Blitz. Great Britain survived Germany's most destructive efforts. Meanwhile, British forces in North Africa were fighting to repel the invading Italians. Britain managed to keep Italy out of Egypt and push them back to Libya. In the beginning of 1941, the Africa Corps, led by General Erwin Rommel of Germany, was sent to help the Italian forces. Rommel's crafty methods eventually earned him the famed nickname, the Desert Fox. Britain held on. In May of 1941, Britain had regained control of northern Africa. In March and April of 1941, the Germans quickly captured Yugoslavia and Greece. When British soldiers retreated to the island of Crete, Germany orchestrated the first ever airborne invasion, dropping thousands of paratroopers who quickly took the island. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, began on June 22nd of 1941. Hitler broke his promise to Stalin to not attack, and the Soviets soon suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties in the surprise attack. The invasion went well for the Germans. This lasted briefly, however. Instead of taking Moscow, Hitler opted for a dual-flank approach, sending some forces north to Leningrad and some south towards the Black Sea. Meanwhile, the harsh weather began. October rains caught the Germans in mud. In early December, as German troops began to march into Moscow, winter began. Temperatures fell to negative 40 degrees. The German advance stopped as abruptly as it had started. President Franklin D. Roosevelt from the United States hoped to win the war without joining by supplying the Allied nations with weapons that they needed. The Lend-Lease Act gave 38 European nations about $50 billion in U.S. aid. Japan decided to cut off vital Chinese supply lines from Southeast Asia. Japan entered and controlled northern Indochina. The U.S. responded by cutting Japan's supply of American goods. Japan wanted to return to its expansion plans, so it turned to the one force that could stop it, the United States Navy. On December 7th of 1941, a Japanese task force attacked the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. They sank 4 battleships and destroyed nearly 20 aircraft. The next day, the United States, Canada, and Great Britain declared war on Japan. The Soviets, in 1941, recovered and pushed the Germans back 100 miles outside of Moscow. In spring of 1942, the Soviets had effectively stopped the German advance. The Allies were soon on a roll. They won battles in Africa and forced Italy to surrender in 1943. In 1944, the Allies prepared for an invasion in northern France. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met together in 1943 in Tehran, Iran, to discuss the strategy and plans behind the invasion. They talked to each other about a British and American large-scale attack, called Operation Overlord, on the beach of Normandy along the northern coast of France. This attack was to be known as the D-Day invasion. It will have been the largest seaborne invasion in history. The invasion would deploy Allied soldiers ashore on 5 beaches under the code names of Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The Germans were not sure what beach the Allies were going to attack, so they built a chain of fortifications along the coast called the Atlantic Wall. Hitler left German General Rommel in charge to strengthen their defenses. Rommel put up barbed wire, he mined the water, and he concentrated his troops near Calais, the narrowest part of the English Channel. On June 6th, 2,700 Allied ships carrying over 175,000 soldiers, led by General Eisenhower from the United States, crossed the English Channel. Paratroopers were dropped off behind enemy lines to capture bridges and railroad tracks. D-Day caught the Germans by surprise. The Germans fought fiercely, but they did not win the battle. The Allies built a temporary harbor to receive supplies and a pipeline across the English Channel for oil. Near the end of June, about 1 million troops had accumulated in France. The Allies advanced slowly in the beginning, but reached Paris on August 25th to liberate France. Slowly, the Allied forces moved toward Germany. The Germans put up a strong last defense as the fighting began to take place in Germany itself. The Allies began their final assault in 1945. Soviet forces were advancing from the east to Berlin. British and Canadian forces came from the north. The Americans and French forces neared central Germany. In all, the Allies had almost surrounded the Germans. Prior to closing in on the Germans, those Allies passing through the previously occupied areas were terrified at the sights at the concentration camps that they encountered. Hitler committed suicide before the Allied forces took Berlin. On May 7th of 1945, Hitler's replacement signed a declaration of unconditional surrender ending the war in Europe. In the Pacific, meanwhile, the war with the Japanese was a personal vendetta for the United States after Pearl Harbor. Japan won several key victories, including taking Hong Kong, Guam, Wake Island, defeating the British at Singapore, the Battle of Java Sea, and defeating the United States in the Philippines. The Philippines, General MacArthur's troops were ordered to Australia after leaving the Philippines, and about 75,000 exhausted troops on Bataan surrendered to the Japanese. Most of them were forced to march 65 miles to prison camps, and most of them died. This march was called the Bataan Death March. After the Philippines were captured, Japan moved toward India and Australia. In 1942, the Battle of Midway, in which Japan sent a large fleet to capture one of the Hawaiian Islands, the Americans intercepted the plan and prepared for a surprise attack. American dive bombers dropped down on Japanese aircraft carriers while they were refueling. The Japanese had lost 4 aircraft carriers and at least 200 planes, along with many skilled pilots. Japan had only sunk 1 U.S. aircraft carrier and shot down 150 planes. The Battle of Midway was a clear victory for the Allies. Meanwhile, the Allies battled to regain most of the islands of the South Pacific. The first victory at Guadalcanal set the tone for the United States' slow, island-hopping set of victories toward Japan. Superiority in air and sea combat enabled the Allies to move onto the Japanese home islands themselves. Allied forces first attacked at Iwo Jima. The Marines successfully won the battle, but with a struggle. Okinawa was the next stop. Japan sent kamikazes to attack the Marine landing force, but they still defeated Japan at Okinawa. On August 6th of 1945, due to their refusal to give in to the U.S.'s ultimatum, the B-29 American bomber, the Enola Gay, dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, America dropped another atomic bomb on Nagasaki, after Japanese leaders failed to respond to the first bombing. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan gave in and signed a statement of surrender, ending World War II.